Do you like sports? Do you like art? What about science? Giraffes? Giraffe scientists that paint rugby games? It's all available on Audible, the biggest audiobook site with the largest selection of audiobooks this side of the inner solar system. No need to use your boring old eyes anymore. The ears are the future, my friend. Why, you're using them right now. So check out Audible and get your listen on. Go to www.readlearnlivepodcast.com/audible to start your 30-day free trial today.
I feel like it's a surprising story. Well, I hope it is. Not just the events that Cummings experienced, but also I think that there's something about the openness of Cummings himself and the mobility of his emotions and the way that he experienced all the edges of himself that I think brings a kind of surprise. And I suppose if readers were to take anything away from that, maybe I would hope that they might reconnect with that way in which we can all surprise ourselves sometimes, because I think that's one of our most healing and rejuvenating capacities.
Hello and welcome to Read, Learn, Live, the podcast about improving yourself through literature. I'm your acclaimed host, John Monaster, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 79, where we celebrate the year the Muppet movie was released and the Sony Walkman first went on sale. What a year. As always, if you have ideas for books you'd like to see featured, or of authors you want to put me in touch with, you can reach me at jon@readlearnlivepodcast.com. Today, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with author Alison Rosenblitt about her book, The Beauty of Living, E. E. Cummings and the Great War. Alison Rosenblitt is an academic and a writer of literary nonfiction. She teaches ancient history at Regent's Park College at the University of Oxford. Her first book, E. E. Cummings' Modernism and the Classics, won a First Book Award from the Classical Association of the Middle West and South. The Beauty of Living, E. E. Cummings and the Great War, published by W. W. Norton in July of this year, is her third book overall and her first book written for a general audience. I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. All right, everyone. Hello and welcome to the Read, Learn, Live podcast. This is your host, John Monaster. Very excited to be here today with you. This is going to be posted in August. It's the end of July right now. We are right in the middle of summer and it is very hot and humid here in New York City. I'm joined today by author Alison Rosenblitt, and she has written a book, The Beauty of Living, E. E. Cummings and the Great War. Alison, hello, hello.
John, hello. Thank you so much for having me. It's really wonderful to be here.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to have you on. I really, beyond just having a passing familiarity with some of his poetry, I didn't know so much about him at all. I hadn't read any other biographies or really learned so much about him. So this was a really interesting opportunity to learn a ton about somebody's just of like a very small portion of their life that really had an outsized role to play in their development, which is obviously the case when you talk about anyone in a war and, going abroad and all that stuff. But really, I think was an interesting book to read through. So just maybe to summarize for people, what's the book all about? How do you think about describing the beauty of living?
Well, it is a slice of life biography of E. Cummings. So we start in childhood and then we follow him through his Harvard undergraduate years and 1 year as a master's student, and then to France, where he volunteered as an ambulance driver in the Great War. And we see him in Paris for 5 weeks. And here also is a love story, which is at the heart of the book, where he met a young woman called Marie-Louise Landemont and fell in love for the first time in his life. And then we see him on the front, and then unjustly arrested and imprisoned, a brutal and traumatic experience. And then freedom and what that meant for him and where it left him as a poet and the poet that he grew to be.
Yeah, it's just quite a story. It's obviously very unlike, it's interesting, like maybe there were a lot of similar stories for people his age around then, given the war and people leaving to go fight and everything. But for us today, I think, at least for me, there's not that type of story so much. And I think maybe the big gap there is, people having to go to war versus getting to volunteer for our military now. So I think it's a very different experience for people. So I guess just to kind of take a step back and like at a high level, what got you interested in this at all? I read that you had gotten some, maybe some grant money or something to pursue some of this research, but amongst all of the potential things you could do with your time, what made you think that, hey, I want to focus on E.E. Cummings and I specifically want to focus on this very narrow portion of his life?
Well, Cummings is someone I first read at school and someone that I found myself coming back to at different times of my life and often coming back to different poems or finding different things in them. And I think it was that sense that there was always something new, always something unexpected in my relationship with reading his work that made it feel like something I really wanted to commit to and explore. And I had a sense that the war narrative was just completely underappreciated, both its impact on it, his poetry, and what it meant in his life. And that's very much connected also with Marie-Louise Lallemant. And I would say, in a way, I wrote this book for her. She was what we would today call a sex worker in the terminology of the age. She was a prostitute. And for that reason, I think that she has been somewhat marginalized in Cummings' story. And hers is a lost voice, and it's a voice that I felt deserved to be heard and a story that I felt deserved to be told. So I think I wrote this book in the end as much for her as for anything else.
Yeah, that's really pretty amazing to hear. I definitely picked up that, obviously there's a lot of discussion around her and their relationship and the letters and all that. But yeah, hearing that, this book is as much, telling her story and one that hadn't really been heard so much. You talk a little bit, I think, towards the end in some of your notes about how in a lot of the other biographies, maybe it merited like a sentence or a paragraph or just kind of just a dismissive mention of the relationship without anybody really attempting to delve deeper into it.
I think there was definitely an underexploration. And those letters themselves had not really been examined. And one thing that they show absolutely clearly is that Cummings and Marie-Louise were in love. And that, I think, is the core of understanding what she meant to him and what that relationship really was.
Yeah, totally. So now that you've decided you're going to make this happen, what was the actual process? How did you sit down and go from nothing to a book, I guess, in and however best you can summarize that, years long, I'm sure, arduous process?
Well, I did do a lot of research, much of it archival. As you mentioned, I had grants to work on the book. I was really lucky to have a fellowship at the Houghton Library in Harvard, where most of Cummings' papers are held, and also a fellowship at the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas at Austin, where a smaller but significant portion of his papers are also held. And I'm so grateful. I was just so fortunate to have that, because those archives are incredible. Enormous, amazing, explosive, just Cummings' mind was explosive. And so his papers are just full of ideas, drawings, thoughts, drafts. They're an absolute chaos, but in the most exciting way possible. And so I worked in those for months. And I did obviously secondary research and working with his published work. And then when I came down to write, I tried to select and organize my material. I wrote chapter by chapter, although I wrote my chapters out of order. But I always selected and arranged my material so that when I was writing, I had the what of the content, and then I could just write to try to bring as much emotional honesty to the story as I could. Because I think that was what mattered to me most in the actual writing, is really trying to write an emotionally open and honest story. And
did you find any part of that particularly difficult?
Well, I think the most difficult aspect actually of the book was the 4 chapters. It's about 26 chapters overall, but 4 of them directly concern the arrest and imprisonment. And actually that was the most challenging, because Cummings told that story himself. And if you want Cummings' version of the story, then go read The Enormous Room. but it wasn't my place to retell what he told. Obviously, I drew a lot on what he said, and I interacted substantially with the enormous room, but I knew that for those chapters, I had to tell my own story. And that was hard, but I tried to do it in a few ways. When it came to the arrest itself, I tried to contextualize it historically, because it's a bizarre thing, really, that the French went to so much effort over these two, Cummings and his friends, these two completely insignificant American volunteers. I mean, why even bother? And I think to understand how it seemed from the French perspective, you have to understand where the war was at that point in time, but also how governments were thinking about things like morale and the spread of information. So I tried to contextualize the arrest in a way that Cummings himself, of course, never did, wasn't in a position to do. But then also in talking about the prison experience, he wrote The Enormous Room a few years later, looking back, and he wrote in a very sardonic and wry tone. And looking at some of his notebooks from the time, I tried to bring in those notes and to show that in prison, in that moment, Cummings was on the edge. I mean, he was fighting for his sanity. And you don't see that as directly in The Enormous Room because you see a more processed experience, one that he was ready to reflect upon. But when you look at the notebooks and how raw it is, there are moments where you can really see that staying sane in that environment was a struggle.
Yeah, I imagine. Yeah, that must be so interesting having to, in some sense, compete with the actual person who was there that you're, doing a biography of when you put together your own version of it. But I think that's the advantage here that you have is that you can get that full context and you can look at everything from so many years later and try and paint that fuller picture. All right, but to kind of kick things off for the book as a whole, you started childhood, good place as any to start, I think. And so what was that like? Where did he grow up? What was his family situation? What were his friends like? And how did sort of childhood up until Harvard go for him?
He grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, within walking distance, and I mean a short walk from Harvard. It was round the corner. And in many ways, he had a free and idyllic childhood. He had not only his immediate family, but other relatives who lived in the house. He had a childhood gang with whom he played. He had a sister, a younger sister. They were very close. And it was an outdoorsy and in many ways joyous childhood. But on the other hand, his father, although he was a good man, he was also a man who had a real authoritarian streak. And that was something that Cummings had to struggle with in his childhood and throughout his life.
Yeah. And I think that's something we can get to, as we discuss the whole book, because that relationship, I feel like, really kept coming up again and again and again in many different iterations as they sort of fought and tried to push back against each other. And that was really interesting to read through. So, once he gets to Harvard, what changed? Because it seems like at the beginning of his time at Harvard, things were still kind of the same. It wasn't like he got into Harvard and then a switch flipped and he's like a totally new Cummings. At least that was my interpretation. So what was his sort of gradual shift like as he was at Harvard and especially after he joined the Harvard Monthly?
Well, in terms of his relationship with his father in childhood and growing up, I think it was, as you say, a gradual thing. And also for the first 3 years of his undergraduate experience, he still lived at home. So he was still caught very much between his family and his new life. And he struggled because there were the natural impulses of growing up, the desire to date, to drink with his friends, and his father did not approve of these things. But in his senior year, I think he really began to find himself. And then he stayed on for an additional master's year. And those were the 2 years that most deeply perhaps shaped his literary experience at Harvard itself.
Yeah, so maybe let's get into that just a little because it seemed like that did play an important role for him. And thinking about his writing and the Harvard Monthly experience and his friends, what was it about being with those people that really started to transform him?
Well, you're right. The monthly was enormously important to him and that circle of friends, a number of whom went on to be literary figures themselves, like John Dos Passos, Robert Hillier. And I think for Cummings as a writer, not only does a writer have to learn how to write, but if you back that up, in a way, a writer has to learn how to write. Each writer has to find their own method of training and disciplining themselves. And I think that Cummings was looking for that. He wanted to write, he wanted to be a poet, and he was putting the majority of his intellectual and creative energy into trying to find ways of learning his craft. And he found some of this with his friends. They would read their own poetry to each other and critique it. They would read the poetry that they were encountering through the little magazines. And also, he engaged in extensive private study. He copied out stanzas, some of them from Keats, for example, and analyzed their effects. He studied stanza form. He tried to observe himself. He wrote out all sorts of rhyme schemes and attempted to intuit their effects. So it was a long and very rigorous process of trying to teach himself how to interact with poetry and how to become the disciplined poet that he needed to be.
Yeah, that's just so interesting to me because it seemed like in a lot of ways he was not an amazing student with everything he did, but for some reason he was really drawn to poetry, and not only was he taking classes, but he was doing all this self-study and really pushing himself to learn a lot on his own and achieve. And so it's just interesting to me that's kind of where his mind was drawn to, given that he was such a creative person generally.
Well, he was very driven. And of course, he was also interested in painting, although that may be something that we get to later. But he saw himself as an artist in a visual sense as well as in a literary sense.
Yeah, definitely. So, he started to really become a good poet at some point. It started to it wasn't just kind of random stuff. People really started to like his poetry, and he was writing strong poetry. And you talk about he developed this sort of modernist style. So, maybe for people, you could talk a little bit about this idea of modernism at that time, maybe even compared to today, if we think about modernism differently, and why Cummings was drawn to that, and maybe even some if you've got some poetry lined up from around then that can help people get a sense of where he was coming from.
Well, modernism is a plurality of movements, really, and Cummings was aware of that. He interacted with Cubism and Futurism, and he tried to follow the latest developments in music and painting and dance, as well as in literature. But I think that a lot of the drive for Cummings was the relationship between modernism and free verse. I think that what's important to understand there, perhaps, is that free verse did not mean simply chucking form overboard. On the contrary, in some ways, I think that form actually became even more important to poetry because poems were in this tension with and against form, sometimes starting out with the form and then breaking it, or a draft that might be in quatrains, and then it would be reimagined so that that form was barely visible in the final version. And this fight against form actually gives free verse some of its tautness and some of its energy. And also, Cummings invented his own forms. So you asked about perhaps looking at a particular poem, and one that I thought we might mention, because it's one of Cummings' most beloved poems, is All in Green Went My Love Riding. And that's a poem that I think is mesmeric in its form, and yet it was something that Cummings almost felt his way into. And I'll read you just a little bit of it.
Sure.
All in green went my love riding on a great horse of gold into the silver dawn. 4 lean hounds crouched low and smiling, the merry deer ran before. Fleeter be they than dappled dreams, the swift sweet deer, the red rare deer. 4 red roebuck at a white water, the cruel bugle sang before. And then he uses that form again twice. Softer be they than slippers sleep, the lean lithe deer, the fleet flown deer. And he creates this form that draws the reader on, and it's an odd poem. I think readers often don't know what to make of it. Scholars don't know what to make of it. But something about the intensity of the form just, I think, well, like I said, it mesmerizes us. And that comes from this era of experimentation.
Yeah, that is really interesting. How the form itself can be what pulls us in, can be what draws us in, even if we don't like intuitively, if we're not like 100% like getting exactly, what he's where he's coming from, because like you mentioned, he's just got this like kind of fantastical mind, and it's always off in a million directions, and it's kind of sometimes hard to follow. And I think one of the things you point out throughout the book, as you're analyzing some of his poems, is all these different allusions he makes, and he's got a lot of the classics and the Greeks, and there's descriptions of various gods and stuff. And so, like you mentioned, he's got a lot of this education and training, but not everyone will. But I think sometimes you can even just take away that, the particular form he's using. You can get that sense of that there's something going on there, and that can draw people in. Well, okay, so let's keep the story moving here. We've got so he finishes Harvard and he moves down to New York, where I am. So it's interesting to read some of his the New York stories of where he lived, what he was up to. But it was really just kind of just a little kind of temporary spot for him, because of course this was World War I time, and or also known as the Great War. Which we'll talk about later, but Cummings took issue with that phrasing, as I might as well, interestingly. But anyway, so he moves to New York, and then it's just like, okay, turns out we're going to war, and we're going to start drafting people, or you can kind of volunteer and become an ambulance driver, and that's that's a way. And I think Cummings and many other people realize that might be a better way than fighting on the front lines. So he decided to do that, to volunteer. He took a ship, he went over to Paris, and then just sort of these like several kind of happy accidents occurred one after another, and ended up with him having all this extra time and then meeting this sex worker. So maybe kind of talk to us about what his life was like, right when he arrived in Paris, and what that first month was like. And that just seems like so much happened just at that little moment. Where was Cummings at before and then during that, and how did that, affect him?
Well, I mean, you're right. That month or 5 weeks was transformative in his life. And he arrived in Paris. You asked what Paris was like. It was wartime. And so it wasn't like the city would have been before or after. There were very few young men about. And if you were a young man and you were not visibly disabled and you were not in uniform, you were subject to a great amount of social censure and possibly being accosted by the police. So it was quite a censorious public to be out and about in. But at the same time, there was an amazing amount of modernist art that was going on. This is the era of Picasso, the end of Cézanne. Cummings was able to actually go around and buy prints of their work. He attended the premiere of Satie's Parade, which was an amazing collaboration of the greatest artists of the day in Europe. And I think that it was the first time that he had that sense of access to modernism on the spot, because so much before had been about what was received from Europe, the attempt to follow the latest developments in Europe from New England, from the East Coast. And suddenly being in Paris, I mean, attending the very premiere of Parade, it was like here he is in the very moment that it's happening. And that was incredibly exciting for him. And then, of course, he also met Mary Louise. And that was the first woman he loved.
So, yeah, let's talk about her. Tell me about Mary Louise. Who was she?
Well, she was clearly an extraordinary woman. We know very little about her. We only know really what is in her letters to Cummings and his to her, and some of what Cummings says about her in the notebooks. But she was working as a prostitute or a sex worker in Paris. We know that she loved poetry herself. She actually introduced Cummings to her own favorite poet, Alfred de Musset, who was a French romantic poet. I think that she quite liked, actually, the idea of dating a poet. She used to call Cummings mon petit poète, my own little poet. And she was a woman of some experience in life. She'd seen more of life than Cummings, suffered more perhaps in life than Cummings. She was very open in her emotions. She was a very articulate woman, especially very emotionally articulate. Her letters to him really convey the honesty of who she is and how she feels. And I think that that's some of what makes her such an incredible person to have this contact with across, well, more than 100 years.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it was really fascinating. And I think it was interesting to me that just to look back and forth, you actually printed a lot of the text in some of their letters. And, I know that, for example, we were lucky even to have some of the ones that Cummings wrote because he just happened to write drafts in some of his notebooks. So we have a sense of what they were. But yeah, I mean, do you have a sense that, or I guess to what extent was there sort of a mismatch there? Because I sort of picked up on it where it sort of seemed like at first maybe she was a lot more into him to some degree, and maybe then later that shifted, and when he was in prison, maybe he was more into her, or I don't know. Do you feel like there was ever that like alignment problem, or do you feel like they were kind of together the whole time?
Well, I think that both of them were trying to work out how to be together. I think for each
Mm-hmm.
of them, it was not something they exactly knew how to do. And I think that each of them struggled to trust the relationship and to trust the connection. I mean, Mary Louise, she was a sex worker. She had been hurt by men. She said so to Cummings. And Cummings, for his part, had grown up in a world of prejudice against sex workers. And well, it's not only modern scholars that assume that their relationship can't have been serious. It was also Cummings' comrades, once he went out to the front, jibbed him about it and said, well, she can't possibly actually feel anything for you. She's a prostitute. What do you expect? And they tried to convince him that he'd just been played. So I think that they were trying to work this out in the face of a lot of social prejudice. And I think that confused both of them at times.
Yeah, yeah. And so, you just alluded to that, but yeah, eventually his sort of 5-week honeymoon, as it were, in wartime Paris ended, and he did, in fact, him and his buddy had to go and be deployed as an ambulance worker, and they were on these sort of shifts where they were kind of on the front lines a day, and then like kind of midway, and then back at the camp, and so what was that experience like, and how did Cummings sort of work his way through what that meant?
Well, it was muddy, as you would expect, and boring also at times,
Hmm.
which I think many people who've been to war would speak of. There was a lot of waiting around, a lot of sitting around. And Cummings did not gel with either of his two commanders or with the fellow Americans in the unit. And he actually got on much better with the French, who were assigned to the unit as mechanics and cooks. And that itself angered his commanders, who felt that the Americans should socialize together and should not socialize with the French. So it didn't really go well. But Cummings does seem to have been a very effective driver. I think there's an assumption, because his unit commander was very prejudiced against him, that he was in truth a bit useless. But actually, as far as it's possible to tell from the evidence, he was an excellent driver and took that very seriously, and had a little bit of scorn for some of the drivers who either took it less seriously or were, shall we say, a little bit less skilled. He writes home in a most sarcastic tone about a fellow driver who put gasoline in his radiator because he didn't know the difference.
Yeah. I remember you had written about like he had these sort of detailed maps of the area, like where the right routes were for daytime versus nighttime driving and where the potholes were and everything. Like, yeah, it really seems like he was, trying to take this very seriously and do his best, which I feel like just would have been all the more frustrating than to me to have your commanders just not like you and push back on you and, and give you kind of trouble, for all the work you were putting in, which kind of then culminated in him and Brown eventually going to prison. After it's kind of, they went straight from there to prison. They didn't really pass go. there wasn't much else. And so, once that happened, I mean, I guess maybe just tell that story because it was kind of a bizarre, ridiculous story in the first place, like how he even got pulled into prison and why he sort of made a conscious choice, I think, to allow himself to be in prison. He could have, maybe said things a little bit differently and decided to stick with his friend and then ended up in prison. And then, we get back to what we talked about earlier with the enormous room. So kind of how did that sequence of events go? And what do you think it says about Cummings that he ended up where he did?
Well, Brown wrote some ill-advised letters home, and this attracted the notice of the French censors, and they started to keep a watch, and eventually they picked up a packet of letters that they felt were actionable. They came to arrest Brown, and the unit commander said, well, whatever Brown is doing, his best friend Cummings is surely up to his neck in the same. And so they pulled them both in. And they had the evidence, according to their own lights, to hold Brown. They didn't have any evidence at all against Cummings. But in the course of that day, in the course of that interrogation, it became clear to Cummings that they were determined to detain Brown. And he did not want to abandon his friend. And I think that this was an act of loyalty, impulsive, maybe rash. He certainly did not have any idea what he was getting himself into, but it was loyal and it was courageous. He deliberately tanked his interrogation so that he could stand by Brown. And if he hadn't have done that, I am not sure that Brown would ever have got out of prison or would have survived that experience.
Yeah, I mean, you really talk about the kind of behind the scenes efforts. So there was, Cummings' experience, and you go through that and detail that and what the prison was like and everything, which we can talk about in a sec. But there was also this whole behind the scenes effort his father was going through and working with people at the embassy and writing letters and mounting campaigns to really get him out. And, maybe this is a good pause here and to talk about the relationship between them because, it was kind of rocky throughout as we have discussed, but his father here, like, obviously cared and really mounted an effort and wanted to, take care of his son. So I guess it was just so interesting to me to see the kind of, the slings and arrows of their relationship play out. But in the end, his dad really did want to be that protective figure, it seems.
There was a great deal of love in the relationship from both sides, as well as a great deal of tension. As I said, his father wasn't a bad man by any means. In fact, he was a socially progressive man, an upright man. He just had this authoritarian streak. And in a lot of ways, his father really did come through for him and wrote tirelessly telegrams, letters to bring Cummings' cause to the attention of anybody that he thought might help. Although the man in the end, who was key, is a young man, very young, about 21 or 22, I think, called John C. Wiley. And I went back through all of the documents in the case, and I'm convinced that it was John C. Wiley who got Cummings and Brown out. And I think that giving credit to Wiley, even though in a sense it's tangential to the story, that's something that I felt very strongly about, because after all, Wiley saved lives. He saved the lives of Cummings and Brown, and he went on to have an extremely honorable career and saved more lives actually at the Anschluss, and served his country. And I think an honorable man should go down in the record as having lived the life that he lived. So I have the utmost respect for Wiley and what he did.
Yeah, and I think, I totally agree. And it was just an amazing story that you told there. And, of just to me, especially the thing that hit home, because so much happened throughout this book. If you're not paying attention, you don't really realize these are all just young kids that all this is happening to. I mean, Riley, but also Brown and Cummings, everyone is in their early 20s when this is happening to them. And so it's just kind of mind-boggling, that where a lot of people would be just like wrapping up college or about to get their first job or something, that all these people are dealing with, being on the front lines of a war or trying to manage and help out at an embassy while in the midst of all this. And so it was really just striking to me, I guess, how kind of people are just forced to grow up so quickly and deal with all this. in that
Absolutely. I
way.
mean, Brown turned
Yeah.
21 in prison, just 21. And something that really struck me is that in the entirety of the case, which is say the documents connected with the Brown and the Cummings case, there was only one person connected to Brown who really expressed, his aunt, who really expressed, yes, these letters were foolish in some of what they said about morale and about atrocities of war, but this is a man, a young boy who's been on the front, who's been incredibly moved and affected by what he saw. And to almost everyone else, a lot of older men in the case, they just looked on Brown as an ass. And there was a real lack of sympathy and a lack of understanding of what he had witnessed.
Yeah. Yeah. And just connecting that, that the reality that he was dealing with, but also how difficult it must have been as such a young person to process all of that, I think, and to deal with that. Yeah, definitely. It just goes back to that kind of constant battle, I think, in society over the decisions about when is someone adult enough to do X, or when is someone, people can get a drink at this age versus vote at this age versus own a gun at this age. How do we make decisions about when people are truly adults? But anyway, so he's in prison now, and this was, as you say, a really bad experience. And so maybe you mentioned how in the enormous room it's a bit, it was a bit more, I don't know, sanitized isn't the right word, but at least he had time to process it a bit more. But as you say, from reviewing his notes, it seems like really he was hanging on by a thread. So what was it that you saw that maybe was left out of the enormous room that really led you to come to that conclusion that things were so bad there?
Well, some of those notes, they're strange notes. They're notes
Yeah.
about God and prison and hell, and there's a lot of just emotional charge in them. And also, they're physically somewhat strange. I mean, they're scrawled all over the notebook. When you're actually there's one notebook in particular, you're flipping through and the notes are scrolled over each other. They're on all sorts of orientations. The bits cut out of the paper. They're just a very, very intensified, distilled experience of struggle.
Yeah.
And I think, part of being in the archives and interacting with the stuff directly is just the emotional power of that experience comes across in a way that, as you say, it doesn't. Well, the enormous room is incredibly eloquent, but it is processed. And
Yeah.
the earlier raw experiences are different to encounter.
Yeah. That was the sense I got as well. Just hearing those stories of just all the kind of solitary confinement punishments and all the little things, and just the guards and the head. I forgot the title, but the head person, just the kind of abject cruelty being displayed there. I can definitely imagine would make it very difficult to move on day by day. So then you talk about Cummings as a war poet, in some way. And, whether that was from when he was an ambulance driver at the front lines, whether that was from when he was experiencing things in prison, or maybe even before, when he was in Paris and, when it was kind of a war city, how does he then take all of these experiences and start to turn that into kind of the poetry that people might know him for? How does that connection happen? Is it happen quickly? Is he kind of writing some of that in prison, or is it much later he's reflecting on everything and then turning that into war poetry? I mean, how does that evolution happen, I guess?
It was both of those things. He had notebooks with him throughout his time in France, and they're full of drafts. But then he also wrote a lot in 1918 when he returned. I think that was when some of the key war poems crystallized. But he did actually continue writing about it later, and also some of the imagery of the war was pulled into other poetry. And I think that there's some evolution in the poems that he published. At first, he has a section, La Guerre, which is the war in French, in his first collection, Tulips and Chimneys, which is very direct about his experience. And then in Is 5, which was published later, he he chose somewhat more sardonic, more angry, more political war poems to include. And then that somewhat morphed into his general political poetry. And I think that it's hard to draw an absolute line between the war poetry and the corpus as a whole. I think that those ideas and those experiences did seep in. I mean, to take another example, there's a section, Songs, which is from his first collection, Tulips and Chimneys also. And this isn't a section about the war, but it is a section that he was working on when he was in France. A number of the poems are in one of his French notebooks. And one of the poems, a very beautiful one, Songs 1, he'd written mostly, I think, before he arrived, but he was still working on it. And in France, he added, it appears, based on the evidence of this notebook, he appears to have added one stanza. And that stanza includes this image, it's a classical image of the fields of the underworld. And this image of the shepherd, he says, condemnatory fingers thinned of pity, so he stands counting the moved myriads wonderfully loved. And although the whole poem is about the underworld, that specific image, that pitiless counting of the myriads of dead, he seems to have added based on 1917, but you'd never really know that reading the poem. So it became submerged. And I think that rather than draw a hard line around what it means to see Cummings as a war poet, I would see that as integral to the poet that he became, often in ways that aren't directly traceable even.
Yeah, maybe even not directly traceable to him. Maybe it's just sort of as he is now has this really this deep memory of these kind of crazy incidences in his life to draw from beyond everything else. Yeah, that's interesting. So yeah, one thing I did want to talk about is also he is, not just a poet. Throughout the book, you talk about his sketches and his paintings, and you've got in the middle, you've got a little insert there, and you've got some photos of it, and you've actually got some of his sketches. There's a sketch of Thayer that I actually really, really liked, which was just kind of this beautiful, strange portrait. So he was pretty good, and as you mentioned, this friend of his, Thayer, donated a lot of his work to the Met, and so the Met has some of his paintings and sketches and all that. And I went and looked at some of them online because you can look at all of them, and some of them are quite beautiful. So what is or how did that part of him happen, and why did he feel as if when it came to art that he didn't want to limit himself just to the written word?
He was a very visual person, and he did throughout his life regard himself as a painter as well as a poet. And actually in 1931 he published a collection of a reproduction of some of his artwork, and in the introduction to that he says, in this typically Cummings-esque inverted way of putting things, he says, like many, the undersigned was found to write spontaneously or pictures before finding oneself compelled to draw or words, which is a slightly roundabout way of putting things. But what he seems to be saying is that there's something more spontaneous, more primary, more immediate about images, and that's what the child comes to first. And he did always value that sense of intuitive, childlike art. And I think that was part of his connection with the visual. And he always saw it as complementary to his writing. So, for example, again, years later in 1945, writing a foreword to one of his exhibits, he constructed this kind of fictional dialogue between a critic and himself. And he has the critic say, "Tell me, doesn't your painting interfere with your writing?" To which he replies, "Quite the contrary. They love each other dearly." Which again is a very Cummings way of putting things.
Yeah. But perhaps also the correct way, even if you found a funny way to say it, maybe that is, that's probably the way he would imagine it, and that they do have that relationship. Yeah. I mean, and so, yeah, he eventually, after he eventually gets out of prison, his father, accomplishes that feat, and he makes it out. And then Cummings really focuses on his friend and staying on top of his friend's, problems, and helps get Brown out eventually. Although, as you say, it was mostly Riley that really was able to make it happen. But then he ends up leaving, and he sort of never really reconnects with Mary Louise, and that was just sort of it for that. Do you have a sense of his kind of mind state as he left, and wasn't able to reconnect with her, and just kind of how he felt about the country and that experience just shortly after?
Well, he was sorry to leave, and he only left because his health was in a terrible state, and he really did need to go home and heal.
Yeah.
He was back in Paris for 3 days, and he did hunt for her. And I went back through historical weather data, and I found those days were cold. I mean, they were cold, and he hunted for hours outside. So I think that he really did his best. And then he left her a letter, and he never heard from her. And I suspect that by that point she was dead, although it's impossible to know. But I do find that genuinely incredibly sad.
Yeah, yeah. The love of his life, huh? And just his life is just so crazy. So he makes it all the way back. He comes all the way back to New York, to America. He heals, and then as soon as he is healed, the government drafts him, saying that you are now healthy enough to fight, which just is kind of mind blowing. So then he goes to this Camp Devens, and then it's not prison, but it's this whole new, just disaster of a thing for him, where he has to deal with the military again, and he has problems with authority and all that. And I think here again, you start to use that language of kind of insanity or crazy, or he really, some of his writing from that time period starts to seem off. So what happened there? How was that kind of similar or different to what happened in France?
Well, he himself said, looking back, that he nearly went crazy at Camp Devens. And I think it was what we would now recognize as a re-traumatization. And in some ways, I think that he'd, dug as deep as he could to get through imprisonment, and facing again being cooped up in a camp, again under authority. Sometimes the re-traumatization is dangerous in a way that the first trauma, you were able to draw out on something to get through, but the re-traumatization is a difficult time. And he was in amongst people who were very enthusiastic, not just for the war, but people who had a direct enthusiasm for killing. And he just found that appalling. And it didn't help that the camp was under quarantine for some period of time for measles and for flu. And looking back, well, I think that's something that we probably have some perspective on now.
Yeah. Yeah, it does not sound like fun. So, but that's kind, he eventually gets out, and he gets discharged, and that's kind of where your story wraps up. Essentially, you've got a couple pieces that are a bit more forward than that. So I guess one thing I wanted to check in on is what made you kind of stop there? Do you feel like that's a big, just easy point to stop? Or did you feel like it was difficult for you, like you could have gone a little bit more, maybe there was some more there, or how did you really reach that moment as the place the book would sort of wrap up and begin to kind of move on?
Well, I was trying to tell one story, not the whole story of his life. And so I tried to find in a section on freedom the end point of the specific story that I was telling, and what I needed to say to show the way that the war lingered with him and where it left him. And that's also why I have a flash forward at the end. So the very last chapter takes us almost to the end of his life. And what I was trying to show there is that these events never left him, even though he stopped talking about them. But I think that it's a mistake to think that because someone stops talking about a war, that it's left them. And you can see in his notes from that summer, which was in the mid-1950s, which is, say, 40 years later, he is thinking directly about his wartime experience and what war is and what brutality is and what that did to him and the person it left him to be. And I think I was trying to show, in the sense of Cummings being a war poet, that when you're shaped by something like that, you are shaped for life.
Yeah. Yeah, makes sense. So, just to kind of wrap things up a bit, I forget where I heard this, but essentially that people don't read, I like this line, people don't read biographies to learn about other people, they read biographies to learn about themselves. So I wanted to ask you, if you felt like you had something to share about what you learned about yourself and what you think other people might learn about themselves while reading this.
Well, academic writing is very analytical and distanced, and I've been an academic for a number of years. And writing this story was all about opening up the emotions of what Cummings had been through. And I think that doing that really opened me up as a person. But in terms of what readers might take away, I feel like it's a surprising story. Well, I hope it is. Not just the events that Cummings experienced, but also I think that there's something about the openness of Cummings himself and the mobility of his emotions and the way that he experienced all the edges of himself that I think brings a kind of surprise. And I suppose if readers were to take anything away from that, maybe I would hope that they might reconnect with that way in which we can all surprise ourselves sometimes, because I think that's one of our most healing and rejuvenating capacities.
Yeah, here. Agreed. Okay, well, I think that's a great ending point. I'd like to do a couple little thunder round questions to get to know you, and then we'll call it a day, okay? All right. What is your favorite food and or drink?
Well, I love bitterness in food and drink. So my favorite food is radicchio, and my favorite drink is definitely coffee.
Okay. So you have your coffee black, I guess.
Very much.
Very much.
Yeah.
Okay. Good to know. Where is your favorite place you've ever been?
I think under the shade of trees. I think that's a very calming place to be. And every tree has a different quality of shade. Walking in an oak forest, the canopy and the way that the light comes through, for example, is completely different from, say, sitting under a yew tree, which is a remarkable thing because a yew is incredibly poisonous and you can sit underneath it and nothing grows. And yet under this tree where you can just feel how poisonous it is, you also feel this kind of comfort. Like there's an amazing comfortableness about the shade of a yew tree. I find that very paradoxical.
Yeah, that is. I wasn't even aware that there was a tree like that. So I'll have to go look that up. But I can imagine the oddness of being comfortable in that space. All right, last question. If you could wave a magic wand and change any one thing, what would it be and why? No,
I wouldn't. Because however much you would think that you were doing it for the right reasons, and however unimpeachable the cause, I don't think that it's anybody's right to exercise arbitrary power. And fixing something with a magic wand in the end is arbitrary power.
Fair answer. And thank you for that. That's a very thoughtful one. All right. Well, on that note, I think you can take away from our conversation today that if you thought you knew E.E. Cummings, you did not. And you need to read this book to really learn about especially his early life and kind of this crazy story, everything he went through. And it was well told, and the beauty of living. E.E. Cummings and the Great War. Alison, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, John. Thank you again for having me. It was really wonderful to talk.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Read, Learn, Live. If you liked it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. If you hated it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. And so it goes.